treat this God. Because each god, Bel, Sobek, Ra, Anubis, Yam, they all had their own way of being worshipped. Every god had its own way that you would approach this God. Their own way to be worshipped, their own way to be honored, and their own way to be bribed. You see, your view of God determines your approach to God. In the ancient world, this was very clear. That if I wanted to have a baby, if I wanted my wife to have a baby, then I would go to a fertility god and I would offer that god wine. But if I wanted my crops to grow, I would go to the god of crops and I would offer grain. And if there was sickness in my family, I would go to that god and I would offer a pigeon. And each god had a different shrine, each god had different rules, and a different way of being bribed or sacrificed to. And that's true for us. Our view for God also determines our approach. Because let's be honest, even though there's one God, we have different views or different perspectives of this God. And depending on how you grew up, that perspective really shifts. Here are some common ones, misrepresentations of God that we often run into. You see, there's the good cop, bad cop God. I grew up with this type of God. Where the bad cop God was the angry God who was just laying down the law. He would come in there, he'd yell at you, tell you he's going to destroy you, and then he would leave. And that was the God of the Old Testament. And then Jesus would come in, and he'd give you a donut. Be like, come on, man, just confess that you're like a bad person. But it was all about making sure that you were they were trying to get the confession, or trying to get the rules. So there's this good cop, bad cop. And so you don't want to get pulled over, basically. So you want to figure out what the major laws are that get you in the most trouble, and you want to avoid them. And then you just want to live your life. I don't know if any of you guys grew up with the good cop, bad cop God. Or maybe you grew up with the on-demand God. If you grew up and religion was kind of the side thing in your house, you didn't grow up going to church very often, just kind of Easter week and Christmas type. Maybe you grew up with the on-demand God. This was the God that was there when you needed him. And there's nothing else to watch, and you'll just watch the rerun of Seinfeld, and so it's on demand. So life's good, but oh wait, up for a promotion, time to pray. Up, my aunt's sick, time to pray. Oh, I need something. Let me get this from this God, and hopefully the God comes through. And then if he comes through, that's great. I get what I need, and then I just go back to ignoring that God. The God's there when I need him, and I can ignore him the rest of the time. So maybe that's the God you grew up with. A God that was just kind of chill. But there's also the vending machine God. This God usually doesn't last very long. Because this is the view of God that if you pray for it, you'll get it. And if you didn't get it, it's because you prayed the wrong way. A few years ago, I was talking to my daughter about prayer. She goes, I don't like to pray. And I go, why don't you like to pray? She's like, well, because I prayed for a piñata at my birthday party, and I never got one. To which I was like, you need to talk to your earthly father about piñatas. Right? I'm in the domain of piñatas. I wanted something, I asked for it, I didn't get it. You either have two options. Either you have to assume that, well, maybe God just doesn't exist because I didn't get what I wanted, or I didn't ask the right way. I didn't have the right number of sacrifices. I didn't say the right number of Hail Marys. If you made decisions like I did in college, this is the God that you kind of ignored as you were going out that night, and this is the God you were paying attention to as you're trying to get through the rest of the night. I'll never do that again. I'm making deals with this God. I promise I'll do this. I'll name my kid after someone in the Bible. I'll give a bunch of money to the church. I'll read my Bible all the time. Well, whatever I got to do to get something out of him. And then there's the anti-stuff God. Originally it was the anti-science God. Then it was the anti-science and progress God. And then there was the anti-science and progress and Disney God. And I was like, wait a minute. It's just the anti-God. This is the God that seems to be against everything. If people are having fun somewhere, this God's unhappy. And there's more and more pictures of this. And if you, like me, grew up with a distorted picture of God, then your approach to God's also going to be distorted. Your view of God determines your approach to God. And so if you have a good cop, bad cop God, your approach to God is to behave. And you want to make sure everybody else behaves. Maybe you've been to a church like that. The pastor yells at you for not getting your act together because that pastor feels the weight to make sure everybody around them behaves. Maybe you have an aunt or uncle, or maybe you have this shame that just sits there, and you look at this area of your life, this addiction or this regret or this shame, or you can't get over something, you just this scar, and why can't I be right? That's the picture of that good cop, bad cop. Or maybe you have that picture of an on-demand God, and so you just kind of ignore God until you need him. And it wasn't until a crisis moment happened that brought you here. The vending machine God, you're always trying to get that right thing. But your view of God determines your approach to God. And there are three major approaches to God to talk about this morning. I'm sure we could sit around and come up with other ones, but there's three that I want to point out to you this morning, and they're this. There's the avoid God strategy. There's probably a God there. I think there's a God there. I kind of believe there's a God there. But we're cool. My life's good. God's going to stay over there. God will take care of heaven. I'll take care of my life. And maybe you know people who fall in this category. This is where most of your atheist friends would fall. They're so committed to avoiding God that they want to deny that God even exists. Have you ever noticed how strange it is that atheists seem so invested in proving that there's not a God? Why? Because this is their approach. Because who doesn't want at the center of the universe to be a God overflowing with love for them, who forgives their sins and fixes their brokenness? Who's not signing up for that story? But that's not the picture of God they have. They have a picture of God who didn't show up for them. They have a picture of God that allowed people to be mean to them or people that they love. They felt rejected by the church, and that was probably legitimate. But because of that, they don't want the God of that church to exist. And so they choose avoiding. It also happens here oftentimes if you feel like you've made the mistake that you could not get over, you made the worst mistake, I swear I would never do it, and then you did it, and then you kind of just, well, maybe there's not a God who cares about that. So we fall in this avoiding God approach. The other one is the bribing God approach. This is the sacrifice approach. I'm going to give God whatever he wants so that God will give me whatever I need. So if God wants worship, I'll give God worship. If God wants my tithe check, I'll give my tithe check. If God wants me to read the Bible so that I can feel like I have a happy life, then that's the trade I'm going to make. This is the belief that the God of the universe is not actually on your side. That you believe that this God has to be talked into liking you and doing good things for you. And then there's the surrender to God approach. Surrender is what happens when you give up your plan for happiness to accept God's plan for happiness. That only happens if you believe that if you believe God has a plan for happiness and you believe that God's on your side. You can only surrender to a God you believe loves you. Else you'll just resist. That's what resistance is. It's to be dominated by something you don't want. Surrender is to receive that thing, to be dominated by something you love. And God is after surrender.